Today's fairy tale is another wild ride by Madame d'Aulnoy, the French writer who came up with the term fairy tale. It's called The Story of Pretty Goldilocks, but it's not Goldilocks like the Three Bears. This one involves giant murder and poisoning by beauty products. There's this princess, everyone calls her Pretty Goldilocks because she's got beautiful golden hair that goes down to the floor and has perfect waves. Everyone who saw her fell in love with her. Well, there's a young handsome king in a different kingdom who has never seen her, but he's just heard how hot she is, and so he's decided he wants to marry her. So he sends all of his ambassadors with signs of his wealth to go tell her, hey, this dude wants to marry you, but she says, no, I don't want to get married right now. And so they come back and they're like, oh, she turned you down. There's a man at court named Charming. This is sort of where the idea for Prince Charming comes from, except he's not a prince, he's just a courtier. But he's called Charming because he is, and he's gorgeous and he's sweet and everyone loves him. And he makes this offhand remark that, if the king had sent me to get her for him, she would have said yes. Well, he has enemies at court who are jealous of him, so they tell the king, and the king's like, throw him in a dungeon. So he languishes in prison for a while, and finally the king comes to see him, and he's like, dude, what did I do to deserve this? We're buds. And the king's like, you said you could have gotten her. And he's like, yeah, I would have drawn an amazing picture of you and used such beautiful words that I would have gotten her to love you. And the king's like, oh, sorry, dude, that's totally different. I'm gonna get you out of prison and you go get this princess for me. So Charming goes on his way and says he doesn't need like an entourage or anything. He just takes his little dog named Frisk. As often happens in fairy tales, on his way he helps out 3 animals that will then help him later. First he sees a carp that has hopped out of the water, he puts it back in the water, and he helps out a raven being pursued by an eagle, and he finds an owl in a trap and lets it out. And so all 3 of these animals say, we'll help you later. He goes to the princess dressed up like a real 1600s man, wearing rich brocade, scarlet and white plumes, and threw a splendid embroidered scarf over his shoulder, looking as gay and graceful as possible. Back when men were men. So he goes before the princess like a good wingman, but she says, I can't marry your king until I get this ring back that I lost in a river once. So Charming goes, sits by the water, and he's like, oh, I'm never gonna get her to marry the king. But then that carp shows up and says, hey, here's that ring I heard you needed. You're welcome. So he goes back to the princess, gives her the ring, and she's like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Didn't think you would do that. Well, I've got this other problem I need you to solve for me. There's this other prince in another country that wants to marry her, but he is a giant and he's threatening to lay waste to her country because she said no. And she said no because I could not marry a frightful giant as tall as a tower who eats up people as a monkey eats chestnuts and who talks so loud that anybody who has to listen becomes quite deaf. I don't think I'd be down with that guy either. She's like, you gotta bring me back his head. And he's like, oh, okay, off to my death. But he approaches his death with swagger. The giant says, bring out your little boys and girls, pray do not stay to do their curls, for I shall eat so very many, I shall not know if they have any. And Charming says, come out and meet the valiant Charming, who finds you not at all alarming. Although he is not very tall, he's big enough to make you fall. So Charming prepares to die in battle against this giant, but then that raven from earlier swoops in, pecks out the giant's eyes, and when he falls to the ground, Charming takes his sword and chops his head off. And then he does what the princess asked and brings his head back to her. She says, I still need you to do one more thing. I want to get this magic water that's like really perilous to get that makes everyone beautiful and young forever. And he's like, you don't need that. And she's like, I want it though, so go get it for me. He's supposed to go into a cavern with an immense hole, which he must go down, and it's full of toads and snakes, and then he has to go down another hole and find this fountain and bring some of the water back in a flask. But thankfully, that owl from earlier shows up, and it just swoops down the hole and goes and gets the water in the flask for him. So he comes back triumphant. So she's like, all right, I'll marry your king. And so she accompanies him to the king's kingdom. But on the way, they start to talk, and she really likes him. She even says, why didn't we stay where we were? I could have made you king, and we could have been happy together. He's like, I am loyal, and I would not do that to my bro. That's morally wrong. And she's like, you're right. They get to the king, and she does marry him, but she really still likes Charming, and it's very clear she prefers him, wants to be with him all the time. Charming's enemies go to the king, and they're like, you need to get rid of Charming because this girl really wants him instead of you. Again, the king has Charming thrown into a dungeon. The princess begs him to let Charming go, but the more she begs for Charming, the more angry he gets. So the king decides she'll want me more if I'm even more handsome, and so he knows she's got that flask of eternal youth and beauty. So he sneaks into her room, gets the flask, and rubs it all over his face. But then the narrator tells us, turns out it's not the flask of magic water. One of the princess's maids had been cleaning and accidentally broke and spilled the magic water, and so she replaced it with an identical looking flask and put inside poison that is kept around the palace to get rid of, undesirable people. So unknowingly the king rubs poison all over his face and he falls down and dies. The princess gets Charming out of jail and marries him, and they live happily ever after. Good thing they had that convenient, clumsy maid so they could be together getting rid of her husband without being guilty of murder. I guess it was meant to be. As always, check out my book, A Retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses, another beautiful fairy tale, and my podcast. All the links are in the bio.